Welcome to Questions We're Afraid to Ask.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We've got a great show tonight. We're going to hit a couple of different topics. We have Tracy, and I'm going to butcher your hyphenated name. I got it right way back when, but it's Tracy Deveugle-Frink. Are you close?
Deveugle-Frink, yep.
Deveugle-Frink. All right.
Very good.
She works for Western Power in Australia. And full disclosure, Tracy and I have known each other for years. We went to college together. And this is going to be very surreal for me because when I knew her, she had a Texas accent. And now she doesn't. We have questions like COVID, what was the experience like? Power, where are we headed? We have some questions about like how that runs, like clean energy, and the big question I have about like how do we store this clean energy so we can use it and not just have to have it on demand. But Tracy, tell us a little bit about yourself. Give us a little bit of your background. Like, how did you end up where you are?
Oh God, how long have you got? Right. So yes, grew up in Houston and around surrounds. Spent a bit of time in and out of the country. My dad was in oil and gas, so we moved quite a lot in and around Houston. But Houston was sort of our home base, as anybody who's worked in oil and gas would know. Got my undergraduate there in arts. And went out on tour almost immediately with that degree. Did that for a while. Came back, started a company, which I quite enjoyed, which is sort of my segue into getting into business. Met a boy who brought me out to Australia, who also worked in oil and gas at the time. Came to Australia, realized that the company I had been running in the United States did not translate here, where the labor laws are far more punitive, to say the least. We can have a whole other conversation about that if you like, but the unions here are exceptionally strong as opposed to the United States. So what does one do with oneself when your entire skill set is sort of no longer what your market demands? Well, you go back to school. So I got my master's and was hired as a consultant through that process, and then ultimately started advising in strategy innovation, particularly focusing on disrupted markets. So any industry that was going through a revolution, which, in the early 2000s was pretty much everybody. So ultimately ended up specializing in energy and eventually jumped ship into Western Power. So now I am the head of digital products for Western Power. And that basically means that I'm in charge of all of the changes to any of our corporate or OT systems that support the network, or any of our corporate systems that support everything else. So yeah, it's probably a quick summary. I mean, there's a lot of other stuff in there: family, white kids, moving, immigrating, COVID. There's a lot of other things in there, but that's probably the short version.
There's a lot of... Oh, go ahead, Daniel.
I was going to say, what was the business that you were running before?
It's a little bit difficult to explain because there's a bit of a niche, but the concept was essentially production in a box. So for people who had an artistic expression but didn't have any of the technical competence to produce that, we would provide everything else. So everything from production management, stage management, budget management, operations, technical design.
For like putting on like a show?
Any sort of live event. So, for example, one of my clients was ExxonMobil, who had to do their global AGM, which meant orchestrating all of the live feeds to all of their various shareholders around the world. So running all the backstage components of something that's that complex, which is essentially a show, right? It's like a production. So we, ran some of the backstage elements for George W. when he visited the border a couple of times. So that sort of stuff. But also, actually, the mega churches were one of my biggest clients. So when you think about the Christmas part, their Christmas fetes, and their they would do like summer school productions for kids, and the kids would do. But we're talking size of the summit, right? Not podunk things.
Right. And so,
but also, sorry.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, but also, so I did those because they paid well. But the real target market were artists who had an expression, something they really cared about and felt they needed to say, but just didn't have the vaguest idea how to get it produced.
Yeah. How do you put on a show if you don't know how to do it? Yeah. And
Correct.
so what was it that changed? You said in Australia there were too many penalties. Like what made it too hard to facilitate in there?
Yeah, and it's a great use case for me on things that Australia doesn't do very well that Texas does quite well. But obviously everything has a flip side, right? So as you would probably know, there are very few workers' rights in Texas that are
Right.
negotiated. Right, if they're not enshrined in legislation, they don't tend to exist. For example, right to hire, right to fire in Texas is very, very strong, and also your minimum wage is almost non-existent. Right, it's pretty much just the federal minimum wage. In Australia, we've got really strong unions. So in this case of Backstage Presence, the company I built, the organization, so the American equivalent is called IATSE. They're the union that manages all the backstage talent for media. You would know a lot about them after the strike, I'm sure. IATSE is a very business-friendly union. They're very easy to work with. There aren't a lot of restrictions. They do have a higher minimum wage than what normals would charge, but I think this is 10 years ago, right? It would have been about $10 or $11 an hour minimum wage, as opposed to the federal minimum wage at that point, which would have been something like $7.20 or something like that.
Right.
So you definitely got a premium, but the $10 an hour, as you would know, is still below what we would now consider a livable wage.
Right.
So that meant as a business owner, I had some room to move with hiring union and non-union workers. So I could hire union workers for projects that required it, but I pretty much had to get who I was given. So I just would take the next most senior person who's available, because that's how the union dispatches people, and the prices were all the same. In Australia, there isn't anyone who's non-unionized, so you can't go off the union rates, and it's because the union is so controlled. They're always in demand. It's a little bit like OPEC, but for labor. So it meant that, and the minimum wage here is closer to $20 an hour. And I haven't adjusted that for the exchange, but I'm going to say it's probably closer to that $15, $18 an hour, which makes it really hard as a small business to find a margin on top of that.
Yeah.
The other piece that was a little bit unique was because I did a lot with churches and religious groups of all kinds. They often had particular requirements that they needed. For example, they didn't want somebody coming in who had huge amounts of tattoos or facial piercings, because it just didn't align with the ethos of what they were trying to do. In the union model, you can't choose that. It is, you just get who you get, and if they've got a foul mouth or don't have a great deal of respect for religion, as an example, which again very common in the arts world, there's nothing that you as the procurer of that service can do. Whereas if you're hiring just off the street, I could self-select, say, yourself or Bill, because you're clean cut, you know how to behave yourself around small children or people who are deeply religious. So it just gives you the level of flexibility to hire at a wage where you can make a margin. Whereas in Australia, that room doesn't exist. You pretty much get what you get, and that made it very hard for the model to function.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's fascinating, because I've known you for years and I've never heard the why you went into something else, right? Because we just never had that conversation. It just never came up.
Well, so probably also worth mentioning. I also found as I was running that business that I'd fallen in love with the running of the business more so than what the business was doing. So I was really enjoying strategy, and I was enjoying the conversations around strategic partnerships and modeling a forward cash flow and working out what I could do, what I could tweak down here in order to make that number be bigger. So I was enjoying that part more so than I was actually enjoying the production by the end. So by the time I realized that the model wasn't going to function here, I kind of didn't mind, which is partially why I went back to do the MBA, because I kind of went, that's the part I like. Let me learn more about that, and then we'll figure out where to go after that.
Interesting. So let's go to the next one. Let's go to COVID. So, because it was crazy. I mean, it was crazy everywhere, but like
it was
the
crazy.
lockdowns in Australia were insane. So
I should say the information we got about the lockdowns in Australia felt draconian, and I was afraid that you were getting marched off to a little camp if you had a sniffle, because that's the kind of stuff that was getting fed to us through the media over here.
Yeah, well, it's pretty funny because that's pretty much what we thought about you.
And Texas was like, screw that, we're not going to do any of that. So.
Yeah.
Well, I'll start off by saying, the preface here is probably useful for the energy conversation as well. Texas and WA, so WA being Western Australia, which is where I live, share a lot of cultural traits gentlemen.
Ah.
We also talk about seceding from the Union every once in a while, but we don't really understand why we need the rest of the country. We are probably what I would describe as not as conservative as Texas, but by Australian standards, we're considered conservative. Also very heavy farm ranching sort of, but with a good healthy dose of commodities in there too. Ours isn't so much oil and gas, but mining is our big, but it serves the same, culturally it serves the same role as, I've got a pit in my backyard where they dug out a bunch of nickel and now I'm a millionaire. And very, very wealthy mega farms out in the middle of the bush where, they probably have more money in 1 year than I'm going to make my entire career. So, so very, very, very similar makeup. Also cities that have a very different opinion from the country. So very, very similar culturally. So I never went through culture shock here, by the way, because it was, other than driving on the left, it was practically like living in San Antonio. So
better beaches.
Oh yeah, I have to say we do have much better beaches, unless you count like Padre Island, Corpus Christi, like that. That's what the whole west coast of Australia looks like, all the way.
I've got to get down there. there.
So the question was COVID. So we are a tale of two halves in Australia. So if you're talking about the east coast, so Victoria, Melbourne in particular, Sydney, they would have had a similar time probably to any of your major metropolitan cities in the United States, with the exception of the fact that we never really got big infection numbers because we basically took a lot of the same tactics, but we took them weeks earlier. So the real reason that the 2 weeks mattered at the time was because that interrupted the infection cycle. So if you could get people
y'all
locked
shut
down
down travel,
first,
right?
We did, and I'll come on to that in a moment. But if you cut the people mixing together in the first 2 weeks of the incubation period, it means that the people, by the time they discovered they had it and had symptoms, they would not have been active for those 2 weeks, which means they wouldn't have infected anyone. So it keeps your infection rates really small. So even then, if it expands, it's expanding much slower and lower and later. So it makes it easier for the health system to cope. We also, of course, saw New York probably go through it about a month before it came to Australia, 3 weeks or something. I don't remember exactly now, but it was about, my memory is it was about 2-3 weeks between when we saw Italy and then New York, and then we started to see things coming up in the east coast of Australia. WA had a whole nother couple of weeks after that, because most people don't realize how far we are from literally anywhere. So it's even to get from here to Sydney is a 5-hour flight. So there's a huge drop off in traffic between the east coast and the west coast, and you only come in really by flying. There's no practical way to get here by any other means of transport. So by closing the borders, we basically bubbled ourselves immediately. Because when I say we're 5 hours, there's 5 hours of desert between ourselves and the east coast mostly, and 5 hours at least of ocean between us and everybody else. So
I was going to ask about boat travel. So it's 5 hours.
I was going to say,
okay.
Our closest analog is
plane.
probably, our closest analog is probably Hawaii, because you hit LA and then you've got a 5-hour flight from LA across a liquid desert, right? Which is all the ocean is.
It's very similar. As a matter of fact, Hawaii is one of the use cases that we look at for energy use for a really similar reason, but we'll come on to that later. So it meant that we had good warning of what was coming. And because of that, we shut the border as it was coming to Queensland, which means it never actually got to WA. So we as constituents, we never shut down, ever. We had, I think, a total of 1 month where we isolated in bubbles. So we were never locked into our houses. We had sort of a neighborhood bubble which meant we could get out and move around, and I could take my daughter bicycling and that sort of thing, go down to the river, that sort of stuff. For about 4 weeks, and that just so happened that they did that over at like our version of spring break. So we lost 1 week of school. We had the spring break, which is 2 weeks, and then first week of the next term, and that was it. That was the totality of our lockdown.
Wow.
We never locked down again.
And did it eventually come through? Like just
not really. Only after the borders opened up in 2022.
Okay,
and by then
so it did eventually
we were
make its way through.
Vaccinated by then.
Oh, okay.
We were at 9 because we made vaccines mandatory for all of our government jobs. I heard your conversation the other day about the executive branch and whether they should have the right to sort of park constitutional rights. Found it really interesting
Right.
because in our case, obviously, we're not a democracy in the same way the United States are, and culturally, we're not the same either. We're also a commonwealth. We're not a federated state system, which means our executive branch is typically not as strong, but can pull on very strong powers because, of course, we still have a monarch. So that structure still exists. It's just very, very rarely ever pulled on. And we're also culturally much more comfortable with hierarchy. So
Right.
the premier is standing up and saying, I'm going to mandate vaccines, while there absolutely was resistance and it was extreme. So we had people who became unemployed because they self-selected to not vaccinate. You're talking sort of 5% of the population protesting rather than sort of 30%, which is probably a bit more where it was in the United States. So we were much more comfortable with allowing some of those draconian measures to come into place. And for us, it was fantastically successful. And to date, the premier who did all that stuff is by miles the most popular premier we've ever had. Because the other thing I should point out is our economy never dipped either. Two reasons.
Right.
Because the state never shut down, all the interstate commerce never stopped. So most people were still employed doing things. Even tourism kept going because essentially it meant that everybody who would have gone to Bali or Sydney is now going to Broome, which is in the north of the state. Right. So we were all even still traveling interstate. So that just meant the money moved around inside of the state, which meant everybody stayed employed. Also, because we're heavily commoditized, we were still getting state revenue through mining, which of course doesn't have a lot of human touch points, right? So the mining was quite easy. All of our mining now is done, most of it's done autonomously at this point. So the trains are autonomous. The barges are largely autonomous. So no human contact required. So the mining just kept going. So we just kept feeding China and kept our, so our unemployment, I think, peaked at about 10%.
Wow.
It also sounds like y'all didn't deal with the same level of crazy misinformation paranoia that was going on here, which I think is a huge part of what was happening, especially in the early on days.
We got all the same stories you did. We got all the same stories you did. We heard all the same conspiracy theories, and we still had people trying to allow it to get traction. And in certain places, it certainly did. So places like Victoria, where the lockdowns were extreme, you saw it, and this is a great example where panic and conspiracy, they're like long lost cousins, right? It got better traction in the East Coast. In the West, we're sitting here going, you've all lost your minds. I don't understand why this is so hard. Just stay inside for a little while. It's not the end of the world. Now, I appreciate that that's partially because we were very lucky, very, very lucky, because we were hit practically last. So we had the luxury of learning from everyone. But the interesting thing was because we weren't sort of locked in fear, we generally found that people were being much more logical about the thinking.
Yeah, I know there was a lot of stuff going on there with the stories, but I think a lot of it, I think in the end though, we've found out that quite a bit of it actually ended up being fairly accurate, which is what's crazy. You know, I'm currently reading I heard Brett Weinstein was talking on, I think it was on Rogan. He was talking about this, that what this vaccine wasn't a vaccine, it was a gene therapy, and it was actually turning your cells into vaccine factories instead of putting a vaccine in your system. And the concern over the long-term effects that we have no idea where this is gonna, what this could do, because we didn't test it quite well enough. So I think I worry that there's going to be if in a population that got 95% vaccinated, are we going to see a rise in other medical issues because of this thing that we didn't really know enough about?
Well, possibly, but frankly, with the aging population being the way it is, we were probably going to see something like that anyway, right? There's enough toxicity in our lifestyle that
for sure
we don't know enough about, right? Like ingesting of microplastics and all kinds of other things that are also just as likely to create some sort of an aging endemic issue later on. I guess in my mind, and this is just my opinion, I'm pleased to say that we're all here to have that debate.
Yes.
Whereas statistically speaking, without it, there's a good chance that one of us would have had a death in our family, which would probably have changed the color of this conversation quite dramatically.
I did. My wife's uncle passed. He was also had been medically unwell for many years and had a lot of, so it was sort of like, like that was, he was had multiple comorbidities, and it was awful, but it was not surprising, let me put it that way.
Yeah.
But
so, and in contrast, my father has a heart condition and would have been in the high risk category. By the time he actually did get COVID, and he did eventually get COVID, he had his fourth vaccine and basically had a head cold. So can I, hand on heart, say he would have had a head cold anyway, because he would have been one of those lucky people? Of course I can't. But the chances with his comorbidities, as you mentioned, that he would have had a much harder time with it.
Well, and
no question to me that it saved his life.
I had a really rough time with it. I mean, I had the worst in my family, and I know why. And I ended up having to go do monoclonal antibodies, and I kicked it, took care of it. It was great. It was sort of like, oh, I should have done this a week ago. But
and I actually had a very bad reaction, not only to COVID but to the vaccine itself. Like, it put me down for over a week. And then I got the very mild version, which is when I finally caught it, that when everybody was finally catching it. And while I was only like sick for about 10 or 12 days, it took almost 6 months for my lungs to get back to where I could hold any kind of air or have any endurance. My doctor thinks that has to do with the underlying Houstonitis that I had, which all three of us are from Houston, so we understand what that is. Houston used to be the smoggiest place in the United States. We'd fight for LA every day to see if we were more smoggy or whatever. And so my doctor's like, well, you probably had underlying lung damage you didn't know about. Plus, I grew up in secondhand smoke households and that kind of stuff. So, for me, it's really like, I should be able to ask questions without you calling me a conspiracy theorist, right? That's where I'm coming from, right? I should be able to ask questions, or I should be able to ask questions without you changing the Webster's dictionary definition of what an anti-vaxxer is. And I'll give you an example. Like, I believe in modern medicine. I believe in Western medicine. I think vaccines work. You know how I know this? Because my oldest son, Ricky, who can't stay away from a stray cat, 2 weeks ago, insisted on going and petting a stray cat in the corner and got his finger bit like 12 times. And then the cat ran away. So Ricky got to experience the rabies vaccine and the rabies treatment at the emergency room, which is like 12 shots up the arm. And, and now he's got his last series of rabies vaccines coming. So I think they're great. But, asking a question about a vaccine doesn't make you an anti-vaxxer, right?
It does now.
It does now, but it didn't used to.
I think so. Two things I'll say on that, and I prefer not to get into a big debate about whether or not vaccines
Fair enough.
COVID were a good or a bad option, because frankly it doesn't matter now anyway.
Yeah.
Two things. I think we have to be careful when we conflate personal experience with public health. Because public health deals completely in statistics, right? And it's a pure numbers game. It has nothing to do with an individual's health outcome. They're actually even considered completely different sciences, because one is actually more a modeling and statistics piece. The other one is more of a actual physician's medicine piece. So I try not to conflate those in the same conversation about decisions made in the interest of public health versus what an individual may or may not make decisions about their own health. Where this comes into conflict is just at this issue of a vaccine really only helps at the public health level when you get over a certain percentage of the population vaccinated.
Right.
Because we all know there's that 10% who can't get vaccinated, and the only way to protect them is for the rest of us to have lifted. So other than that one place, which is really just the most modern version of does the needs of the few outweigh the needs of the many? Right? Yes. So personally, you may have a terrible reaction to the vaccine. Does your personal experience outweigh the fact that we're trying to protect a 5% total of the U.S. population, which would equate to about 7 million people? Right? So I would prefer to have that conversation in that context rather than I personally have a good or bad experience with the vaccine, or I personally have a philosophical issue with the vaccine, and I'm not. So, but then there's a different conversation about the safety of that vaccine.
Right.
And so if we split those conversations out like that and kind of go, this is why vaccination as an en masse is important, even if maybe you're a little bit on the fence about it. Separate that from, but if we're going to do that to people, right? If we're going to ask people to take a hit for the benefit of our community,
right,
we do need to be as comfortable as possible with the efficacy and the safeness of that vaccine. Now, I think the challenge you're going to have with that debate is there was never going to be a way to convince people that it was safe in the time that we had.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, so you were always going to ask people to take a leap of faith, and by definition, you lost some folks along the way, and that's
right. I think
totally predictable.
I think at least the problem that I see here is that we, and we don't do enough safety testing on any of the vaccines that we put out in general, and so we've gotten used to efficacy testing, but without safety testing as far as vaccines are concerned, at least in the U.S. And so once this one came out and people were like, that sort of sparked that thing of like, oh wait, we're not safety testing any of these things? Like, okay, hang on a minute. Now I have more questions. And then suddenly you're like, now you're a vaccine skeptic. It's like, no. My kids have taken them all, but I'm like, but why aren't we safety testing these?
Yeah.
So as it happens, because of Peter's background, my husband has a PhD in statistics and was going through medical school when COVID hit. So he was a hot commodity when it came to forward modeling the data associated with COVID. So he was in some of those national level calls about how do we decide what the virus is going to do, basically. What is the data telling us? I can tell you hand on heart that they were absolutely safety tested. The vaccines were safety tested. They did not have the checks, the quality assurance checks that the government normally does, because they tend to take years. So what didn't happen is the triple and quadruple checking of the data by the 4 or 5 different government entities that you would normally triple check. Now, we could have a great debate as to whether or not that's a good use of everyone's time, but this is a great example of how you run in a crisis is not how you run an organization under normal circumstances, right? So,
no, absolutely.
Yeah. But I take your point that it is very new. If I could use this language, it's very new technology. I know it's a bit weird to talk about medicine and technology, but it's essentially like technology. It is a very new technology that we put into our bodies, and I can understand why people are nervous about it. And there will be, I think, a debate until the end of time. If you think about MMR and polio, we went through the exact same debate when those things rolled through. I had my MMR, I would have been, 6? I'm in my 40s now. We will be the first generation to get old with those vaccines. We'll find out if the safety testing that we've put in place and more or less held as the safety standard for the next 30 years is appropriate, probably in the next decade or two. And the question will answer itself.
Yeah. Well, we just found out that, was it ibuprofen's bad for you? And there's all these, we're sort of finding out a lot of, maybe it's not ibuprofen, but one of those over-the-counter aspirin ones, they're like, actually, if you take this when you're pregnant, it causes all of these issues and all of that. And so it's like, nobody knew,
And we've vacillated on aspirin being good for you at least 3 times in my life, right? So.
Oh God, yes,
sure.
yes.
And the simple answer is every human being is different.
Yeah.
So for every time you make a rule, there will be a percentage of the human beings for which that is not the case. So at some point, you just got to step back and go, do what's right for yourself, and just let it ride. You'll throw yourself up your nuts otherwise, right?
One of the reasons I've always appreciated you as a sounding board is you always had a much more international view of the world than I did because of your background and life experiences in general. But what I think Daniel and I are seeing is like what a lot of traditional Americans do who are so busy living life they don't pay attention to stuff is we're like, wait a minute. We thought this thing was happening and it's not what we thought was happening. So we have questions now, and it's just happening with a lot of stuff right now, and everything over here is so polarized, and it's just everything's overly political, and everything turns into a fight, and somehow we forgot how to have a civil debate, which is part of why Daniel and I started the podcast. We want to be able to bring people on and go, look, because like we had a friend of ours on who was like, okay, so I don't think we landed on the moon, and we're like, okay, so tell us why, and we try to have a civil discussion about that, and not just be like, you're wrong, right? Okay, tell us why. All right, let's go. Okay, and we try not to bring our opinions as much as possible into it.
We did a bit on that one. I was going to say what was interesting about that though was was when we talked to
Anthony.
talked to him about that.
Yeah.
Thank you. I completely left my head. It was sort of tell us why, and then there wasn't anything behind that assumption, and so we were able to go like, he goes, well, what about this? Oh, well, this. Oh, I didn't know any of that stuff. Okay, well, why else do you think it's not real? Well, this. Oh, well, this. So there's always that important thing to go like, well, I think it's this. Well, why? Well, because I
Yeah.
do, I guess. I guess it's just the thing I've always believed,
Or the I saw a compelling argument for a conspiracy theory, and so I just bought it at face value and didn't do my own research.
Yeah,
Right?
Got
I
to do your
think
own
the biggest
research.
we can get into. There's probably a whole different hour podcast on why I think Australia uniquely has not bought into the same mechanism of debate. I can't even call it a mechanism. Whatever it is that we do now in the United States that is passing for debate.
Fight. We fight.
Fight.
Yeah.
Fight. There you go. Fight without necessarily throwing punches. Why that hasn't taken hold in Australia in the same way that it has in the United States. I think some of it's cultural, which is interesting to explore, but I think also some of it is the way we've set up our method of government. And I'm not to say that our system is better, because it's obviously got other challenges. That just creates different kinds of challenges. But I do think it'd be interesting to do a bit of a comparison on why I think, in our case, that particular flaw or that particular aspect of the way American government has been set up has created this flaw for you that it hasn't created for us, because we are set up just a little bit differently.
That would be fascinating.
I'm just conscious we haven't talked about energy yet, and we're half an
Yeah,
hour
I know.
in.
We will. I was
Sorry. Like
I
you
was
said,
gonna-
we riff until we get to where
we
we're
go.
going.
Yeah. So I was going to say, to add the government being different, how is the education system there? Is it similar? Is it geared differently from what you can tell?
Do you mean sort of K to 12, or are you talking higher education?
K to 12, and then probably also higher ed as well. But
I was going to say, is K-12 there set up to just pump out people to go into college, like
No.
basically the way it is set up here now?
Yeah. So certainly we it is a preference. So it is. I would say that's, if I could use a road analogy, that's probably the highway. But there's an acknowledgement that people are going to take the exit ramp. So that's okay too, if that makes sense. It is an expectation that you finish year 12, but I would not suggest that it's nearly the same. Because you got to remember, in mining, there are thousands of jobs that don't require a college education for which you can make six figures. So driving a truck will easily get you $100,000. Again, this is Australian dollars. So quick, easy. We're about 60%. So you kind of have to add a bit more. Cut it down for American dollars, if that makes sense, by about 30%. But depending on what the exchange rates are doing. But you could easily make 150 grand just driving a truck up north. So it's part of our DNA, actually, in the West in particular. East is a bit different, I think, but in the West in particular, it's in our DNA that absolutely you can make good money without necessarily going to uni, which is what we call university, by the way. So that's point one. Secondly, we've got a very strong I think you guys would call associative degree programs. So we call them TAFE. It's essentially what I would call trade skills, trade certifications of all kinds, including trade certifications in things that you would in the US you would go to a 4-year university to get. So you can get a grad cert here in business, grad cert in accounting, grad cert in digital, for example, which is only a 2-year degree. Or sometimes and they have different levels. So there's a grad cert, there's a cert 1, cert 2, cert 3, and at cert 4 you can then train other certificates. So it's almost that trades college. You can almost see it as journeyman 1, year 2, year 3, and now you get to train other people. So it's taking that journeyman structure into something that you can take as a qualification that allows you to move from employer to employer. So that's a relatively strong. Well, we would say it's weak, but that's what the politicians will say. Comparatively speaking to what you have in the United States with your associated degrees, it's a very strong program here, and it's very popular with, with anybody who doesn't necessarily suit themselves to a 4-year degree, but also a lot of our retraining, retooling of older generations happens through that sort of TAFE program. It's also very popular in regional and rural areas where if you want to stay in the little farm town that you grew up in, you probably don't need or want a 4-year degree, and you don't want to go away. You don't want to. We're not big movers over here. We don't go away for uni, most of us. So if you want to sort of stay in your region and get just enough information about something to be able to run your own farm, or become the plumber in the local town, you can kind of do all that regionally and not have to leave your region. So it's and a lot of our Aboriginal programs are aimed at getting our Aboriginal community members into TAFE in order to help them create a career for themselves that they can use to support their families. So that's a much stronger component.
I'm hearing better overall.
The other part is, of course, that our university degrees are really cheap. They're not free, but they're cheap compared to the United States. Is that
because it's state school, or is it just cheaper?
Well, they're all government sort of pseudo-owned. It's a little complicated, but essentially they're all underwritten by our government, the vast majority of them. And even if they're not owned, they're heavily subsidized. So there's a little bit of it's a little bit like how charter schools work in the U.S., where there's money from the government per capita of a person who comes, and then the student pays the remainder. That's sort of how it works. We also, but we also have independent schools, K to 12. So we do have what's called an independent school, which essentially is still part of the education department, but has its own school board that can set some parameters around that university, and it is still government funded. So,
So I spent a little time on the Western Power website today looking at some of the initiatives, because I do want to talk about energy. There's
school system was
a huge problem that we
gave me, Bill.
No, it wasn't. Hey, we go where the conversation feels organic.
I didn't read
until
up
I
about
force
that.
something in. I know. But you have a kid in school, and you went to university, masters there, so you got.
She's
you got
in
some,
private school.
Okay. So one of my biggest gripes with green energy, and it's not that I don't think we need a better form of energy, is how do we store the power? And this comes down to part of the fact that I work in the tech industry, and I understand one of the biggest problems we have right now in general is power storage, right? Usable, reusable, good battery storage. And in Texas right now, you see all these get solar programs for solar, and you used to be able to sell the energy back to the electric company, but they tweaked the laws where now you get a credit, which is almost worthless. And so you end up with an electric bill, and you're paying for your solar stuff, and you have nothing to show for it unless you can afford the household batteries, which are horribly expensive to put in. So I was like, so how do we store this power? And we've got all these. We've had several winters now where like they hadn't winterized the wind turbines, and we weren't getting the energy out of solar. And this one wasn't that bad, but we had snowpocalypse about 2.5-3 years ago, where thankfully my parents live on a little ranch, and we were fine, and we had we had the fireplace and all that kind of stuff. But Daniel got chased out of his house, right? Because the grid almost failed on us. They said we were minutes away from the entire grid shutting down. And I'm like, yay, okay. That being said, the U.S. power grid was basically built in the 30s and hasn't really been modernized appropriately.
So can I just clarify one thing? You are not on the U.S. power grid.
No, we're on the Texas one, right? Yes, we're on the Texas grid. But like the overall grid in general.
East Coast and a West Coast in Texas, right?
Yes, and it's worth pointing out that there's absolutely no logistical reason why you are not interconnected, other than the fact that you're Texas and you don't like your neighbors.
Yeah, we're ornery. I perfectly understand the fact that we're ornery, and we're doing it because we might have to kick them out and go off on our own one day. I think that's the only reason that it's been set up that way. But all of this is like, okay, so we're generating power, but that's power that has to be used now, right? And then I looked at y'all's website, and I'm like, oh, you have a community like battery system that I don't have to upfront $50,000 for my house, and I can add $2 a month for my electric. Sign me up. In fact, I messaged Daniel earlier, like, why aren't we doing this here? Oh, wait, that's right, because the power industry here is all private, and they want to squeeze as much cash out of me as humanly possible. And But seriously, if we're going to talk about getting off of fossil fuels and that kind of stuff and lowering carbon emissions, we need a battery storage. We need some kind of power storage unit. And what are we doing? What is the industry, not just Western power, but what is the industry looking at? Because there are problems with lithium ion batteries in general. Just the sheer amount of material, much less if we get into like the ethical questions of where it comes from, how it's mined, and all that kind of stuff. I remember Elon got up not long ago saying, "Hey, there's not enough lithium for me to give everybody an electric car in the world anyway, so we're going to need something else." So, uh, you know, what's the solution there? Or do we have one, or are we working toward one? I know there's a big, giant question, but
There are lots of parts of that question, so I'm going to try to break it down a little bit, if that's okay. So, first of all,
Please
can
do.
we go green without batteries? We can go greener without batteries. Yeah.
Okay.
So there's a step before total greening of the grid, which is what oil and gas has been on for ages. It always comes across as a little self-serving, but they're not wrong in that to take the grid totally green probably requires a level of technology we do not yet have. That's the honest answer. And let me break that down why that is. So I'm not a power engineer, right? So I can't explain to you specifically the electrons and what they're doing that's going to cause some of these constraints that I'm going to describe to you. So you're just going to have to let me say it and trust me for a minute, unless you want me to bring another guest on to explain that for you. But the grid has to do several things in order to deliver a safe electron to your house, right? It's got to ensure that supply and demand matches all of the time. And when you were talking about the big freeze, that's essentially what happened. Was you had more demand than you could supply, and that's why they talked about the grid falling over, right? Because the golden rule in electricity management is your supply and demand must equal at all times, and that's in real time. There can't be a lag. So if there's 5 minutes where we've got too much supply, beyond, I mean, there are tolerances in the lines, et cetera, and the transformers, but if you go more than sort of half an hour where the supply is substantially over the amount of demand, or vice versa, the whole grid shuts down. Yep. So that was easy in the old world because you basically had generation on a knob that the network controller could adjust up and down. So when you came home and turned the house power on, I went down to the coal-fired power station and I nicked it up a notch in order to supply the power you needed to turn your house lights on. Mm-hmm. That's essentially all the grid did for about 100 years. And as grid operators, because electricity was so terrifying when it first rolled out, we did a really good marketing campaign to the world to say, don't worry about how your electricity functions. Just pay your bill and trust us that the power will come on. Don't worry about why it's complicated, which is making this transition exceptionally difficult because now we're having to deal with some real complexity that we've hidden from the public for a really long time because we didn't want to scare you away from the product.
Like
that
what?
Is now having a big influence on what we can and cannot allow you to do. Now, fast forward to solar. So when solar became hot and everybody started putting panels on their roofs and you were given a feed-in tariff, which is what you got paid to feed the network, there were two things that happened that were very difficult for us. One, we had no control over how effective your solar panels are, when they were going to generate back into the network. So that dial that I had on the coal-fired power station is now being diminished because there's all this free-flowing, free-ranging electricity that's coming up the grid the wrong direction. So instead of coming from the heart and feeding out towards capillaries, it's coming from the capillary trying to run its way back up through the heart. And you can imagine, if anyone's done any medical studies, what that will do to your circulatory system if you try to run the system the wrong direction. Mm-hmm. Again, there are tolerances. So for many, many years, your 6 kilowatts across the 80 megawatts of the entire grid was probably insignificant. So we absorbed it and we absorbed it and we absorbed it. And to be frank, network controllers were probably a bit slow to realize that compounding problem would eventually get to the point where we could no longer control it. And that is essentially what's happening all over the world. So the solar has gone in and during the day, it nets itself out usually. So what usually happens is you produce some number of kilowatts, but you're also consuming some number of kilowatts because you've left your air conditioner on or your electronic systems are on, whatever, right? You're right. Power. And during the day, that will net out. Under certain conditions, that doesn't happen. So the other problem, of course, is it's pumping. You're not at home. Your consumption is probably not very high. So you're essentially becoming a net generator now. especially on days when it's nice and cool outside. There's no cloud cover, so you've got full solar pumping, but it's nice and comfortable inside. No one's running any air conditioning or heating. You're probably not at home, so the lights aren't on, the radio's not on, the computer's not on, your oven's not on. So your consumption's quite low, but your generation's very high. You've now basically become a tiny generator. And it's you and every house in the block now. So now your entire feeder has become a generator. And the problem that I've got now as a network operator is I can't troll down the coal-fired power station enough to account for your solar, which is creating instability in the network, right?
Okay.
You with me so far?
Yes.
That's when people talk about the belly of the duck sometimes in the industry, that's what they mean. They mean that middle part of the day when everyone's at work and all of our consumption tends to be really low because you've all centralized in big office towers somewhere, right? Consumption is really low, but solar is really high. There's a corollary problem to this, and that is, what do you do when you get home at night at about 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening? What's the first thing you do?
Turn everything on.
Correct.
Yeah.
What is your solar doing at about 7 o'clock in the evening?
Turning off.
So there's always been a natural spike. This is what we call the head of the duck. There's a natural spike that happens in that 5 to 9 time frame, which has always been the peak on the network, generally speaking. Let's leave heat and stuff, seasonal changes out for a second. There's always been that daily peak when people come home and turn on the oven and the air conditioner and the television and the washing machine and the whatever. It's now being exacerbated by the fact that the solar is coming off at the same time, which means that generator that used to have to pump 1 megawatt is now having to pump at 6. And it can't take an hour to do that. It's got to pump immediately. As soon as we see the demand, it has to be able to respond. Now, I don't know how much you know about coal-fired power stations, but you can't just turn them on.
Right.
Right? They don't just pop on like a car
Takes
engine.
time.
They take time.
You've got to heat
warm
them up,
They have to
right?
create exactly right. So that means that if I turn off the coal power station, I now have at least a 4-hour lead time before I can turn it back on again. So that means in the belly of the day, I can't turn it off, even if I want to, because there's enough renewables on the network. I can't, because I will not have the ramp time to bring it back on when everybody gets home from work.
The best analogy I have for that, for people who don't understand electricity, is if you've ever seen the old movie where they're having to shovel coal into the train, they got to do that to heat the boiler to make it work, and it takes a little bit of time, and eventually it'll go fast, but you've got to spin up. There's no switch.
Correct.
Right?
And so we call that, because we're engineers and we call things what they are, we call that spinning reserve. That means I got to keep the machine running, even if it's not necessarily putting energy onto the network. I got to pay to keep it running, even if I'm not using it, because I need it to respond really quickly. Now, just as a thought bubble here, this is where oil and gas have a good argument, because coal fire works that way. Gas does not work that way. Gas can respond in a way that coal can't. And gas is better for the climate than coal. So when they talk about gas as a transition fuel, that's why we get kind of excited about having gas as an option, because that becomes what we call a balancing fuel. It means when you've got that gap between what the renewables can provide you and what the demand is doing, we can fill that gap with gas at the moment. So your question about storage, Bill, means we don't need an answer to that storage question to a certain extent, to green the network. Because with gas as a balancing fuel, I can accept quite a lot of renewables, because I can use gas to fill in the gaps between that intermittency, because we haven't even talked about what happens with clouds and solar.
Right. Hang on. Can you, so the photons are hitting the solar cell on the top of somebody's roof, and they're going either into the house, but if the house doesn't, can you turn off the flow, or are you just stuck with the power? It's coming no matter whether you want it or not.
So it depends on your jurisdiction. So this is all happening. So from an innovation point of view, you're right in the middle of it. Like someday the History Channel is going to do a thing about this transition period, because that's kind of the moment that we're in. So in most cases, especially if your solar is older, so I've had solar on my roof for probably 8 or 9 years now, that solar is probably what we would call uncontrolled, meaning it doesn't come into my house, actually. What it's doing is going through your meter back onto the grid immediately. So the electron that you're consuming is not the electron that you're generating.
Okay.
Because that would have been, you would have had to have for
like a
technical reasons I'm not
controller
gonna
or
go
something
into.
in there.
There's a
Yeah,
whole brain that has to go in. How do you balance that, right? And it's
Right.
DC to AC and converting that AC to three-phase to run your house. Like, it's all very, you'd need a
Yeah.
brain to sort that out. You'd need the
Makes
equivalent of
sense.
an automated network controller, because you're essentially creating your house as like a nano grid, right? With all of
So
the challenges and safety issues associated with that.
let me ask, this may not be the right analogy. Are you essentially trying to push water up a water hose as it's coming
Yes.
down? Okay.
Correct. Yes.
Is it now you may not, does it go up and like get turned around and come back the other direction, or does it have to go all the way down the other end of the wire?
So ironically, I don't know that we can tell you exactly what happens to the electron that's generated on your roof and
Okay.
exactly what house it ends up in, because it's actually quite a dynamic environment, because it may end up in your neighbor's house. It may end up going all the way up to the transformer. So because the way electrons move through copper is dependent on a lot of things like reserve capacity and inertia and a bunch of other things, right?
Okay.
So it's a little complicated to tell you where your actual electron lands. Suffice it to say, it's unlikely that the electron that you have generated, the green electron that you have generated, is exactly the same one that you consumed when you turn your lights on.
Interesting. Okay. Okay.
So go ahead.
I was going to say, and the reason I'm kind of focused on the battery stuff, not just because it affects like my industry and like cars and all that, is one of the big things. One of the big things I get yelled at a lot when I'm like, well, we kind of need natural gas still. We kind of is like, no, must be pure green now, and I'm like, we can't. There's a problem, and I haven't had what I needed, what you just gave me, to offer that kind of explanation. I'm like, I know it doesn't work, but I don't have the mechanics to explain it intelligently without sounding like, a moron who just disagrees with you, right? Which is why we ask guests on to come and explain to us how this stuff works.
Okay, when I put out my power system engineer friends are going to laugh so hard that I'm the expert in this conversation.
Well, if you've got somebody you can send down the line to us to get more detailed,
the problem is that finding somebody who has that depth of knowledge but can translate it
into English
for the rest of us is a little tricky. So that's why they're happy for me to have the first chat, and then you can come to them with the real questions. Sorry, so
that's why we don't
storage.
let engineers talk to people. That's basically what it is. Yeah.
So I'll talk a little bit about what's happening in the West, because we're probably going to crack this nut first. And I'm not saying that because I'm arrogant. I'm saying that because we're in desperate need of a solution. Because like Texas, we are also islanded. But unlike Texas, we haven't done it because we're ornery. We've done it because the line losses coming off of the grid to connect us to Queensland across that 5 hours of desert I mentioned makes it impractical to connect to anyone. So we are not going to solve our. So the bigger your grid is, the more room there is to move in the system, right? So the more anomaly you can absorb before you've got a problem, which means in this environment, small grids are feeling it first. So Hawaii, and also anybody who hasn't pulled on a base resource like nuclear or heavy investment in gas, right? So places like Hawaii have felt it, Israel has felt it, and WA is definitely feeling it. So we're at the stage now where the roofs of the houses in WA now produce more power than the whole rest of the generation fleet combined when they're all pumping at once. Yeah. So we have enough renewables now connected either at the transmission level, so those are the big solar farms or wind farms, or on the houses to run the grid pretty much completely during the day if we could balance it up effectively. So if we could get rid of that intermittency problem that I was talking about before, we could run the whole grid.
Is that from clouds and stuff?
The challenges are, you'll see a cloud bank go over, and you'll watch the solar generation go as it feels that cloud move across the sky. Now, I'm pretty sure you don't want your air conditioner or your power feed to your electricity system to do that when the power goes over. You'd like it to stay nice and consistent, right? Because that's how you blow up appliances, is when the frequency does that.
Right.
And it causes all kinds of problems of balancing across the three phases. It's a mess to try to manage that intermittency, which is why everybody at the moment is still using it to balancing fuel. Now, the question I get asked a lot about why people get hung up on storage is because they think about solar and wind, and then they ask the obvious question, what happens when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow?
Right.
First of all, we're in the windiest place on Earth, so we don't usually have the problem of the wind not blowing. But, it does stop occasionally, thank God. And even here, we have like 300 days of sun. We even sometimes have days where the sun doesn't shine. Short term is where lithium ion batteries, so 4 hours, maybe 6 hours at a pinch, is all the lithium batteries will give you. So your community battery, that's about all you can expect to get out of it. So it will help on, so for example, we're using them quite a lot, those community batteries that you mentioned, we're using them in those ramp periods in particular, or the peak, cutting off the peak of the day, to sort of say, when we try to do that ramp, I don't have to ramp the diesel as much, or not the diesel, the gas as much, because I can use the battery in those couple of hours, that what did I say, 6 to 9 kind of time frame. I can dispatch the battery in that period and cut the edge off of that ramp a little bit, which means that I don't have to ramp the gas as much, for example. Or what we call balancing, which is where you've got super hot days and every generation is pumping because every air conditioner in the state is on. We can use the batteries on that sort of 10 to 2 when it's at its most hot and everybody's air conditioner is working as hard as humanly possible. We can use the batteries to shave that part off. And for us, that's very exciting because it means I don't have to produce very expensive capacity on those lines that are only going to get used maybe a couple of weeks out of the year, right? So those are the places where batteries are really coming into their own and are likely to get, there is a market where you can buy and sell electricity the same way you buy and sell socks. In WA, it's called the wholesale electricity market, and those owners of those batteries are dispatching that at those times because that's when the price is really high. So they can get paid for the infrastructure of the battery, and that's how the community batteries make their money. It's actually owned by the retailer, who then leases space on those batteries to the houses. So you pay like $1, I think it's $1 a day or $1 a week or something.
One of the other amazing things that I saw that your battery thing is doing is y'all had a project, and I'm going to butcher the name of the town, so I apologize to everyone in Australia. The Pinjarra. Okay. They were having like fairly regular outages because of, again, getting into like the heat and the resistance and the distance for transmission for power. They needed some kind of other solution, and apparently your battery system there, like you said, I think y'all call it on your website like a microgrid, is helping fix that. So I'm like, I can see West Texas benefiting from that kind of thing.
So like Texas, we've got little towns with big stretches of nothing in between, which means that they're connected by essentially a giant extension cord. And imagine what happens to the extension cord. And the repair time on that tends to be very long because they're out in the middle of nowhere, right? So it takes us a while to get a guy in a truck to show up to figure out what's going on. So that's what we call an islandable microgrid, meaning normally it's connected to the grid, and that's great because being connected to the grid means you don't have to worry about things like inertia and reactive power and all that kind of stuff. But when you get disconnected, the battery can kick in and keep everybody running for a period of about 4 to 6 hours while we try to fix it. So the idea being that in most cases, you never even know that the disconnection has happened because we're able to fix it before the battery runs out and the whole thing just corrects itself, and then you recharge the battery off of the grid. So that's what I mean when I say batteries are really, you're looking at short-term storage, which solves a lot of problems, but not all of the problems, which is why you'll see most of the grids, when we talk about going green, most of us are talking about kind of 80% green, which is miles from where we would have started. So in WA, we're looking to retire coal completely by 2030, 31, something like that. So there will be no more coal on our grid anywhere. We're also looking at major connections of industry that had previously been running on diesel connecting to that grid that is now sort of 60 to 80% green. So that's how we're chunking it up, if that makes sense, to get to net zero. The last part, and this is the part that from an innovation point of view, we do not yet have a good answer, and that is long-term storage. So this is 8 hours plus. So when you get to really, like in the middle of the winter, when there's hasn't been sun in a long time, so think about London, right? No real wind to speak of, no sun coming through the sky for long periods of time. What do you do then? Kind of what kicks in at that point? There's lots of great innovation happening at this space. Nothing on the scale that the grid can use. There are some places that have had luck with things like hydro storage, which is basically using dams as a mechanism to store power. Some people are getting quite excited by hydrogen because if you can create properly green energy, you can store that green energy in hydrogen, but the power loss out of that is extreme. So you, to your guest last time's point around power loss, you consume a great deal of energy to store a very small amount. But if it's totally green and renewable and you weren't going to use it anyway, because we've actually got points now where we're generating more power than we can use on those really hot sunny days when no one's home.
Oh,
Right? So there's a theory that you can take all that excess storage that we would probably be grounding out anyway because we can't pump it into the system, use that to then create hydrogen and store it either for large-scale shipping. So large-scale shipping might go hydrogen because it's nicely storable fuel, and they can purchase it and use it that way, so exporting it essentially. Or we can use it as a balancing fuel to feed back into the network. Very inefficient, but if your inputs are all renewable, then maybe that doesn't matter.
And I also saw that Australia is now encouraging like hydrogen cars as an option, like a third option. I've read some stuff around that, and this is, I get into this. Well,
yeah, so let me
more so
pause you
than
for a
over
moment.
here.
Well, yeah. The problem you're going to have is, and this is a classic, anybody who remembers Blu-ray will understand the difficulty here. The best technology doesn't always win.
yeah.
Right? So it's a combination of best technology at a point in time where a consumer is willing to buy it at a price point that consumer is willing to pay.
Yeah.
And in the case of cars, the big barrier to entry is going to be the network required to fill the car.
Mm-hmm.
And in most jurisdictions that are taking climate change seriously and like actively attempting to correct it, electricity has just gotten there first. So the likelihood that anyone's going to pay to put the hydrogen infrastructure in now, so Australia, for example, we've already started to electrify the highways to allow for electric charging of cars all the way up and down the state. The likelihood that the state government is now going to pony up any extra money to drive in infrastructure to allow hydrogen to also fuel along those same roads is unlikely. Much like once Blu-ray got out with its Blu-ray player, the Laserdisc had, there was just no chance, right? People were not going to buy a second device to watch movies on. And the Laserdisc, even though it may have been a more superior technology.
DVD was Laserdisc. Yeah. Blu-ray beat out
Was
HD
DVD. Yeah.
Yes.
And
HDVD.
VHS beat out Betamax, and Betamax was better.
Yeah.
So
basically because they got to market first, right?
Yeah.
And by the time people had made that infrastructure investment, they were unlikely to do it again. The same thing is likely to happen with cars. Now, the places where that hasn't been decided yet, so these are the watch places for hydrogen, is in transport. So long-haul trucks, long-haul shipping, and planes are the three places where we really haven't decided yet what the green fuel of the future is going to be, because no one's made any large-scale investments in that space.
Yeah, because
we know that electricity is probably not well suited for those.
Yeah, the big problem I see right now and we're not going to get into who, why, where of the politics, but that they're trying to shove down people's throat right now is the long-haul trucking must be purely electrical. And with what we've seen so far and what little I've been able to read, you're going to have to stop your truck every 120 miles and take 2 hours to 12 hours to charge the truck. And that just doesn't work for a country like the U.S. where 18-wheelers run 95% of our, material back and forth. It's just not going to work. We need a different solution. Doesn't mean electric's not the one.
Have you looked at electric F1 yet?
No, I haven't.
So you might have a check because most of that's not true anymore. The range on some of those, so those are F1 vehicles, so their torque is exceptionally high, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not ironically, they're not a bad litmus test for where long haulage is going because of the torque that they require in those trucks. They are now on par with any normal F1, or they're coming close to par of any normal F1 vehicle in terms of torque on the electric engines now.
How are they able to run as long? Without
so two different problems. So the torque is problem one. The second one is length of duration on the battery. I understand now that the latest version of the Tesla, which has not yet come out, but is I think it's meant to come out next year or the year after. I've lost track of it a little bit. Is meant to go 500 miles before it needs to be charged. So
and see, now you're starting to talk about something that people like me would be like, all right, that is a semi-reasonable vehicle to think about.
Now, the interesting question is, if that interacts with the autonomous vehicle, they may have a problem, right? Because the 500 miles is about what a driver makes in a day. If he has to stop to sleep anyway, you lose no productivity if the truck is charging while he's sleeping, right? So that kind of works. If the autonomous long-haul trucking also comes online, where the car doesn't need to stop for 8 hours, now you've got a bit of a problem. So how those things are all going to interact, very hard. This is my old field, right? Disruption. How all those things are going to play out are really hard to predict. So we'll just have to kind of wait and see how the commercialization of those two technologies bump into each other. But this is why in long haul trucking, for example, hydrogen actually starts to make a lot of sense, because you could fill up that truck with a system that could run the whole length of the city or the whole length of the country and only refill it when it gets to the other side. And if you're driving autonomously, drawing long stretches of empty highway, then there's literally nothing to stop it coast to coast. And now you're talking about something that's pretty exciting. Whereas electricity, you're going to have that. But then there's other discussions too about creating essentially battery changing stations where you're not charging the battery, you're just swapping the battery out. So your stop is 5 minutes and needs no infrastructure, because as long as you can trickle charge it, it can take as long as you need it to.
Yeah, I've seen they do that when I don't know what Asian country, but they've got scooters that you just go up and pop a battery out and stick it in and put the other one in, and off you go.
It's my DeWalt drill, you know.
Yes, it is. And I've been pitched to a guy who'd come up with a system that basically did that, but with bigger things. So you could store it in your power wall at home, pull it out, put it in your car, drive your car.
Oh, that's cool. Have two of them and switch them back and forth. That's interesting.
Yeah. Go to a petrol station, but instead of, like you get an LPG tank, instead of getting the tank, you pick up a battery, drop your battery off, and they take your battery and take a new one.
So I'm going to put on my tinfoil hat for a second here and ask you about something crazy. So have you heard about the new? There's a guy who's developed a plasmoid generator it's called a thunderstorm generator that they hook it up to a gas powered machine and it cuts a lot of the emissions out. Have you heard of this? Have you come across this at all?
There are lots of variations on, so I haven't heard this one specifically, but there are lots of variations on what I would call the conversion technology.
Yes.
Of diesel or petrol engine cars. Well, not just cars, engines of any kind, really.
Right.
I've not found one that quite lived up to the hype.
Okay.
Yet.
This one, just totally from what appears to be pretty legitimate. Their plans are online. Multiple people have built them.
So if it's the one I'm remembering, it's the one that Toyota is actually interested in and maybe looking at. And when you get somebody like Toyota going, maybe there's something here, then maybe there's actually something here,
I think,
but
so I've spoken, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I've spoken to most of the car manufacturers in Australia at this point, and very few of them have any intentions of building any more internal combustion engines, ICE engines, past about 2030, 2035. So even if the technology is real, you're probably looking at them for the purposes of keeping vintage vehicles as opposed to technology to be rolled out on new vehicles, would be my guess.
So if we remove the carbon emission piece, just as that goes, is electric car really that much better than gas car performance? I mean, are we?
I think it just sort of depends on what you're after. So
yeah.
Right? So faster off the line? Absolutely. I don't know if you've been in a totally electrical vehicle, but their time off the line is non-existent.
It's crazy.
You feel like
fast.
You're in a spaceship, right? It's crazy fast. I'm talking G-force speed off the line. Obviously, distance and duration is a challenge, but maintenance is much less because there are very few moving parts, right? So the maintenance regime on the back of those vehicles is you're pretty much just talking about the battery itself, some electronic components, the computer brain, and the tires. So all the things that normally break in an ICE vehicle, the oil, the hoses, most of that stuff is eliminated out of the car.
Yeah. So on that, because you mentioned that there, and I was going to ask you about this with the community batteries as well. What does the repair process look like for that? Like, how often are you going to have to change out the cells and the cathode? I mean, like, what's that look like?
So they are essentially pull and plug technology. So we don't actually go in and maintain. It's not like transformers where there are bits in there that you have to sort of and check the oil and all that kind of stuff. Because a battery is largely self-contained and static. It doesn't actually do anything. It doesn't have any moving parts. It's just like a Duracell battery, right? It just sort of sits there and does what it does. There's nothing in there. When the battery dies, you just pull the battery out and put a new battery in. The question that I get asked the most often, and it's a very honest question, is what happens to the battery once it's degraded? So just like the batteries that you deal with, right, in all of our electronic components, at some point it gets down to sort of 60% chargeability, and it's kind of no longer fit for purpose. Now, one good news is the batteries that are no longer appropriate in precision electronics, such as computers and phones, do still have value in my application, because I'm talking about such a big battery now. So even our community batteries are sort of 1 megawatt, right? So that's like 100 houses. It's the size of a shipping container, roughly, the battery. So for that purpose, your degraded battery might still have a purpose in my battery, because I can absorb a lower level of storage ability, if that makes sense, because of the scale difference.
Yeah,
Now,
you can use the old battery longer because you're not having to
batteries.
use a microprocessor, which needs a higher load output. And yeah, that makes perfect sense.
And a faster response time, right? Because I'm talking about such big numbers that it kind of washes out for me. So I might be able to use your old batteries, which is why you might have noticed a lot of phone companies now and electronics companies are now asking you to recycle your devices because they're planning to harvest that battery for other things.
Yeah, they're paying you for it.
So,
yeah.
So that's one. Second one is once the industrial application is gone, so that's my end of town now, it's not even holding a charge for me. What happens to those component parts? And that is sort of the $50 million question. There's an enormous amount of R&D being done now in how do you efficiently recycle those components back into new batteries or into some other application. So to try to close that circular living concept. Everyone knows that's the hole in the supply chain. And if there's anywhere a dollar is going now in battery, there's a little bit still going into battery optimization, but the vast majority of the investment is chasing that recyclability of batteries. For two reasons. One, nobody wants to solve one big problem with another big problem, right?
Right.
So creating waste. The other one is we're going to, as Bill pointed out, there's not we call them trace minerals for a reason. There aren't huge amounts of these minerals out in the universe. Now, as it happens, WA has got quite nice deposits of most of those trace minerals. So if you'd like an opportunity to go, not the same ones that are in the Congo, but for battery creation. So the Congo, the issue is typically more around solar panel
Cobalt
production. Yeah. So we have cobalt in WA also, not as much as the Congo does, but we do have it. So we've got a massive growth in our commodities market. I'll try to connect to the grid at the same time, by the way, to get those trace minerals out of the ground and start to feed that market for batteries. So there are other deposits. The challenge has just been the demand has not been there yet to go after them until very recently. So I do expect us to find more deposits of trace minerals around the world that will take the pressure off the Congo. I don't know that we'll find enough for it to really move us out of the Congo altogether. But frankly, Congo's had rich minerals driving its problems. If it weren't cobalt, it'd be something else. So,
and I agree. I agree with that completely. Yeah. And I also trust Australia to go after the minerals in a more ethical way and force the companies doing it to stick with it and not subcontract out like we're seeing in the Congo. Well, as it happens,
they're getting it from us. So we're not getting it we're mining it ourselves off of our own land. So we know where it's coming
but if we were to buy it from you, I would trust you to get the mineral in an ethical way as opposed to having to go over here.
Completely different subject, but how we're tracing supply chains now and how we as business entities are required to trace our supply chain is starting to become, from a technological point of view, that's starting to be really interesting on how you trace minerals. So how do I prove to you? So diamonds, we can do that. But how do I prove to you that the cobalt came from Australia, not from the Congo? Really interesting innovation question. Maybe for another day.
Yeah.
But so that was your answer to the Congo. Is there are other alternate sources, but they're none of them are quite as big or ready to be online as the Congo is yet, but they're coming.
And I don't, because where I thought we were going to have to go, and I like your answer better, but long term we might have to look at the other answer. And I don't know if you've watched the Apple TV Plus show For All Mankind, the alternate space show, where if the Russians landed first and then what happens afterward, which is amazing. If you haven't watched it, go watch it. Especially growing up in Houston, we get to see Houston in like the 60s and the 80s and stuff. And it's anyway, they find a good asteroid that has more of these than we have everywhere. So it's like, do we need to become the Expanse? Are we ready to start looking at that kind of stuff, which is another great sci-fi thing? Do we need to start looking at mining our resources off planet? And when does that become financially viable?
I can easily say that's already happening. So we haven't actually mined anything, to be fair. But
we're working on it.
NASA
I know
and
we're
the
headed
Space
that way.
Agency are already looking at how do we do it, essentially because, and this is again where WA is probably punching above her weight a little bit, but because we've got huge resources in very inhospitable places, we've done quite a lot of investment. BHP, Rio Tinto, and FMG have made huge investments in R&D around autonomous mining, basically. So, and if you can autonomously mine out in the middle of nowhere, Pilbara, you can autonomously mine on the moon or on an asteroid.
Mm-hmm.
Really, the only problem left to solve is how do you transport it back? So, from an innovation point of view, you'll see now that a lot of the survey data we're seeing coming out of NASA is related to satellite observation of asteroids and comets. That's partially it's scientific endeavor, but also they're trying to get a sense of how can you tell what kind of an asteroid has what kind of mineral on it.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, how do you do your early stage mineral exploration from a drone? So once that's done, I wouldn't be surprised if we start to send out autonomous core machines that go out and drill core on, again, still scientific endeavor, but with a second application.
Yeah.
This is why it's been fascinating to watch us hit an asteroid, land something on an asteroid. I mean, I know people are like, "Why are we wasting money on it?" I'm like, "We're not. This is the groundwork for the future. This is the stuff Tesla was doing when he was figuring out AC versus DC."
Absolutely, and let's be careful not to try to label this as private industry being just whoremongers and wanting to go after big money. There are lots of very good reasons why mining somewhere other than on Earth makes a lot of good social sense, right? Anybody who's lived next to a big hole in the ground can tell you that there are secondary effects of having to live next to mining, and they're not nice. So from an environmental point of view, in most cases, it would be often much better for us if we could mine this material somewhere else and leave the detritus in situ where no one else lives, without ruining someone's country.
So I as far as power goes, I know we saw a big bump in power usage with crypto and data and crypto mining and all that. Is there a concern? Because I'm starting to see with AI, it looks like everybody's going to get their own little AI thing at some point. Is there a concern that there's going to be a big bump in another big spike in power when AI comes out? And is that you all thinking about that at all? Or?
Absolutely, and not so much for Western power because we don't run big AI brains, right? We ingest AI that's usually embedded in other applications like the power system management system, for example. So it's not so much on our side, but folks like GE. So GE is one of the major providers of power system management software. They obviously have huge data ingestion needs in order to run those sorts of applications. Companies like them would absolutely be looking at their greenhouse footprint associated with some of those things. And it is a bit of a hidden cost for a lot of companies because we don't realize how much processing power is being churned up somewhere in the cloud, that magical, mystical cloud place, on our behalf, because we're not smart in how we set up the query that we're trying to run off of the back of the AI. So we're seeing a lot of duplication of processing because we're just not smart in the way that we're using the tool. That makes sense. You're kind of replicating the processing over and over and over again, the copy of the copy of the copy of the copy. So there is some, in architectural circles, there's definitely some conversations about how do we get smarter on how we structure, because sometimes you're even finding AIs going to AIs to ask questions. Because they're just sort of stacking, it's that sort of barnacle version of coding where I'm just gonna pull that piece of code, not realizing that it's actually also engaging Watson to ask a question to come back down.
Yeah. This is how Y2K happens, where you just stacking on top of software.
Correct. Yeah. And this is where, that old saying about if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So programming kind of wafts between these two things, right? I want to go by myself and I don't want to ask any too hard questions. I'm just going to jump off of the last guy and keep going. Gets you to a point, and then eventually you're out too far by yourself, and you kind of have to let the governance and the processing kind of catch up to you, so that you can kind of so you get efficient, and then you can kind of jump again. AI, we're not quite to that point yet, but we're definitely starting to hear the noise in the background to say probably in the next year or two, some people are going to be rethinking how they've applied AI and re-architecting it to be more efficient, or they're going to be hit by a massive whacking big bill for electricity.
Yeah.
Well, and not only just that in general, and I think this is a good place to kind of wrap it up, but you said you're dealing with disruptive technologies and all that. We have no idea right now what AI is going to be as a disruptive technology. To me, it's the equivalent of we had just invented gunpowder, and we just don't know what it's going to do. We can't yet see all the potential consequences that are coming. And
we made fireworks. We don't see cannons coming.
Yeah. But I think that's a really good place to kind of wrap things up. And I know we hit you with a lot of things like education and all that you weren't ready for, but that's all right.
Well, can I just give you one thought on that?
Yes, please.
On the AI thing? because I'm being asked a lot of questions. I've been on like 3 panels in the last year talking about AI.
Oh, cool! Please do. We'll have to do an episode on that.
So in my universe, at least, technology and architecture, we talk about something called the hype curve. You guys across the Gartner hype curve at all?
Mm-hmm.
It's this idea, and innovations all follow a similar pattern, which is we do some early R&D, it gets accepted by a few people, you get a few leading voices who adopt it and do some cool proofs of concept, not actual application, but proofs of concept. You then see this huge spike in interest in the technology. So if I cast your mind back to 3D printing, once upon a time, it was going to revolutionize the world, and we had no idea what it was going to do to us. And it was going to be manufacturing whole bodies and towns and all kinds of stuff. Then it hits the reality of the constraint of reality, excuse me. And there are certain places where commercially it's not viable, technically it's not viable, can't scale to that, whatever. Then there's this pit of disillusionment where we're like, well, that was a big waste of everyone's time. And then it finds its, handful of use cases where it's an appropriate technology to use for that, and then it flattens out. AI is Gen AI specifically, because AI has gone through this hype curve like 5 times since I've been in technology, right? And every time it's come back down again to earth to kind of go, no, still haven't created autonomous thinking robots that are going to kill us, right? So this Gen AI will go through that same curve, right? And absolutely it will find its place, but it by itself is not going to be something that completely revolutionizes our world, because gunpowder didn't either by itself.
No.
There's a whole bunch of other things that also had to come into play before the gun and ultimately the cannon and etc. became things. So I wouldn't necessarily worry about AI specifically at the moment, because right now 80%, just like hydrogen, by the way, height of its hype curve. I've noticed in the last 6 months, hydrogen started to come off a bit. So we're probably going to see it go through the disillusion where everybody gives up, pulls their investment, forgets the whole thing, and then it will land in wherever its niche is meant to be. I expect probably in the next 6 months, my guess, Gen AI will start to have that too. And you're already starting to see that with questions about ethics, questions of interoperability, questions of transparency, questions of auditability of decision making. Right, so you're already starting to see it kind of crash back down to earth around. There are some things that is not well suited to do, at least in its current iteration.
Yeah,
I think you watch that happen.
Well, and I think part of the reason for that is that we keep calling everything AI, and it's not, and we need to start, because this, like you said, this is generative transformer technology. Then we've got machine learning, which we used to call AI, which it's not. It's a different thing.
And it was going to change the universe too.
It was. It was.
And autonomous cars are going to destroy the world too. So it's been a journey, right?
Yeah, I think the reason this one is hyping so much is because of how visual it is. It's really easy to see it, and you go, "Oh, that's scary," and then So I think that's why it spikes so hard.
I think the worry that it has for me actually is not about revolutionizing or disrupting our universe. It's more about disrupting our ability to trust each other in an exact moment where we can least afford it.
Absolutely.
So that is, unfortunately, that is in the very center of the best use cases for Gen AI, is producing something that's not true. That looks real.
That looks true.
Right? Looks and feels real. At exactly the right moment in our history where we are most susceptible to believe it. That to me is when we talk about that feasibility circle I mentioned before about what customers are willing to pay, right? Whether they're willing to accept it, whether they're willing to pay for it, and whether the technology is ready. Smack bang in the middle of that circle, that's something to watch. And watching governments try to work out what they're going to do about that is going to be a really interesting place to watch.
I am hoping.
No,
I was going to say, I'm hoping that Gen X will actually get up off the couch and be like, okay, guys, let's all take a breath and slow down. And
nobody listens to Gen X, so why would we do that?
Yeah, but that's because we've all kept our mouths shut, I'm just kidding.
I don't accept that.
I'm teasing.
But I think it's fair to say that we did try to talk.
Yeah.
And we were squished between the millennials and the boomers. And at some point, we just went,
well, no, I found out you're a millennial, technically.
I am not. 1979 is Gen X.
Yeah, I'm hardcore Gen X, too. But the millennials keep trying to move the number on us. And it's like, I told Daniel that. I was like, you're a millennial. He's like, no.
I am. No.
Yeah, no. Yeah.
I'm in that Zennial time frame thing that they've got now where because I grew up more in that idea of go outside and go away, and and less of that millennial, because I didn't get
None.
internet until
For me, the big
high
line
school.
is if you grew up with digital technology, anything more complicated than television as a kid, you're more on the millennial side. Like if that was a really
Yeah.
big part of your growing up, you're on the millennial side. If you don't remember doing anything other than maybe Pong, you know, you're on the Gen X side.
Yeah, I grew up with video games. That was the thing that I had.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And I didn't really. I think I got a Nintendo. What was a little Game Boy in high
Yeah.
school. I was very excited.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Tracy.